Okay. So, Ashley asked me to do a local history talk, and so I kind of scrolled through my repertoire of kind of theme talks, and a lot of times I'll talk about the railroad, I'll talk about the native tribes and kind of their the early history of the area. I also like to do the railroad, Francisco, all of that sort of thing, but I thought I'd do something a little bit different, so kind of a different way to think about history and kind of the cause and effect and the ebb and flow of things. So before I start, something I'm going to do today, I brought this box and it's full of fabulous prizes, what we refer to as trinkets of joy. They are items that I've collected. Each one has a distinct story and kind of cultural and historical and geologic pertinence to what I'm going to talk about today. They'd said about Sherlock Holmes that he never collected anything that wasn't of significance, either thoughts or objects. Otherwise, he would have just been a hoarder. So I like to think that I collect both, significant thoughts and objects. But so today, while I go through my presentation, I'll be making some pop culture or literary references. And so when I hold up my hand and say, anyone, please feel free if you know the reference, and then you can earn yourself a fabulous prize. And I'm glad to see that Kenny Arnold's not here, because he would have gone home with all the contents plus the box as well. So it's great to see all of you here today. Lots of old friends and new friends, and just very glad to see you. Starting off, I'd like to kind of do some definitions. Probably the biggest one is the definition of geographic determinism, and that's also known as environmental determinism. That's a little bit more of a modern term for it. And kind of the simplified version is just geographic history. This is kind of versus social history. Social history is more determined by human institutions and the way humans interact with each other. Social history kind of determined by, again, how they react with each other. A big part of social history is economic, so I would almost argue that there's really kind of economic on one side and geographic on the other. And so to simplify that, that would be money makes the world go round versus location, location, location. So kind of breaks down into those two areas. My references, it's just amazing, as I age and, well, shall we say mature, especially as a historian. I like to think back about the professors I had. I was very fortunate to study under three really fabulous Colorado historians. First, Dwayne Van Den Busch at Western, then Dwayne Smith at Fort Lewis, and then Tom Noel, Dr. Colorado at CU Denver. And all three very prolific authors, and just really great guys. Dwayne Smith just passed away last month, but very prolific. They've all held the office of State Historian of Colorado, which is, I believe it's a one-year term of office that they kind of pass around. So every time they do that, it's really because it's kind of a showcase for a lot of their works, their kind of paradigms that they've operated throughout their career under. So if you ever get a chance to be in any programs which the state historian is speaking, I highly recommend it. So the first one I'm going to use is the Historical Atlas of Colorado, and that is a really neat one because it's just a number of maps, just Colorado, showing everything from here's cattle production, here's the evolution of the counties, the land grants, and the way the meridians and parallels were set up, which I'll talk about a little bit today. So this is just a really good book, and we use that in Dr. Noel's basic Colorado history class at CU Denver. The other one, I wrote a kind of a career study of Dwayne Smith and Fort Lewis College, and this was his doctoral dissertation. His idea was that Rocky Mountain mining camps were an urban frontier, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. Just a very interesting way of thinking about the development, and just a very interesting change that came with the settlement of the country based on kind of this new industrial scale and industrial kind of predisposition that was going on in the mid to late 1800s.
So a really good book. I both highly recommend.
What's the title, David?
This is Rocky Mountain Mining Camps: The Urban Frontier, and but it's definitely a classic. This is another classic. But this is I always try to do something right before I speak so I don't overthink things. But that was I don't recommend that. I've been reading it my whole life. Going on to kind of defining geospatial perspective. So geospatial perspective is really the context of place and the way things relate to each other. So if you've been here for my archaeological talks, I've gone to 2 digs in southern Israel. It's a mining area, and of course my family being heavily involved in mining, and not just mining, but as my grandmother used to say, mining the miners, which was selling them food mainly. But in Cripple Creek, West Cliff, the Sandgrays, all over the Sandgrays, later in the coal mines, I was highly interested in this dig over in Israel, mainly because they actually think it may have been the place where metallurgy was first discovered. So it has rich copper deposits. They think that somebody was probably having a fire. It's on the kind of the saddle between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. You have a very constant north wind that blows through there. And they think probably somebody made a fire ring and put some of these pretty green rocks on their fire ring, and suddenly they had this magical substance called copper. And then once they figured out they could alloy it with tin, it became even harder and more versatile. And so my first time on the dig was basically staring at a 1 meter by 1 meter hole and digging very carefully with just a little tiny pick or a little brush, and just recording everything that I found, everything that was seen, and just working through the strata. So the strata, as you're going down, you're going back in time. My second foray over there about 2 years ago was actually I was assigned to a young spatial archaeologist, and it doesn't, but it says spatial, again, it's referring to the context of things and how they relate to each other. So instead of that 1 meter hole where you're looking at the micro aspects and context of archaeology, the spatial archaeologist is looking at the macro. So it was really cool because it was what we called adventure archaeology. We had drones, we were climbing up mountains, we were scanning the horizon for any possible disturbances or structures and that sort of thing. So that really got me thinking about how the geospatial perspective really influences history and just human development over time. So, people have kind of sometimes a bad idea about history. I have met too many people, I hate history, I hated remembering all those dates and all of that sort of thing. And so I have something I call the pursuit of history. So it's not just a passive thing where somebody hammers dates at you and just tries to make you respond to what the dates represent or things like that. So to really understand the pursuit of history, I'd like to go back to the Greek, and the first word is histor. And so a histor was somebody that was like a sage, somebody that was a learned individual, somebody that had knowledge. And then the next word of the development is historia. So historia literally means inquiry, and inquiry meaning the explanation of the causes of things. And little kids usually don't start off asking, when did this happen? They want to know why. Why is the sky blue? Why did the birds fly north? So why is really, I think, the predominant question, more than when or how, when we're talking about the pursuit of history. The why is just where we start to recognize relationships. We recognize that cause and effect. Again, that just brings all of this into focus. So when I first started teaching in Walsenburg at the Trinidad State branch office back in 2000, some of my first year students, they were high school students, and I'd say, hey, I'm not really big on dates. And first they get these big eyes like a deer in the headlights about what was he going to do to us. And then the next thing they're thinking is, it's a trap. Okay, there we go. First reference, anyone? It's a trap. Admiral Akbar, Return of the Jedi. So anyway, but they kind of thought that. So I was trying to encourage them to be more inquisitive, inquire, not just have it be a chore where they're memorizing these dates. So think about why things happened. So the context we're going to examine, there's two shapes here. One very beautiful and complex and glorious shape, and one very, just plain and kind of blah. But anyway, for as much as Colorado, I dislike its shape. The first one, we're talking about Colorado. So when I was in college, there was a fairly famous comic that came out that was what high schoolers think all the states are. And it said like all of California was Hollywood, Texas was cowboys, ours was a big square state, and above it was Wyoming, another big square state. So actually it's a rectangle, so not quite a big square state. 380 miles wide, 280 miles tall, enclosing an area of just over 104,000 square miles. It's not a perfect rectangle because there were a few errors. There's one down here right towards the top of the Oklahoma Panhandle. There's another one over here on the Utah line where, because of the ruggedness of the country, they didn't quite line things up. And we see that even here. Some of the meridians got off further north, and we get these places where a square mile isn't actually a square mile because they got the brilliant idea that they were going to correct it by reducing each section by just a few feet until they got down here, and it was perfect. So surveys in Warfano County, good luck. So, something that you can definitely say this looks very artificial, human. I like to, when you look at the map of all 50 states, it almost looks like Colorado was just dropped on where it is now. And to an extent, that's kind of true, because it was dropped on the territories of New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska, and Utah. So our first map is going to be kind of where those were. So at that point, the Continental Divide, everything over here was Utah. This section was what they called the New Mexico Notch. Here was pretty much an extension of where Kansas is today, but it came west. And up here was pretty much where Nebraska came further west. And so, like I said, it was pretty much like it just took a square, just a grid, and just dropped it on these other territories. And that was how we achieved our shape as a state. So I must say, like I said, I really dislike the shape of Colorado, and part of it is I have identification envy. Texas, everybody knows what the outline of Texas looks like. You make an outline of Texas, everybody's like, oh, that's what that is. Colorado, you do this, it's like, oh, hey, it looks just like your whiteboard there. So, not very excited. So, as much as I love Colorado, I don't really care for the shape. Talking about some of the very earliest things that really go back to the kind of the geospatial cause and effect. So we have to go back to geologic events. So the geologic event, a few weeks ago, there was a gentleman here that gave a really interesting talk on plate tectonics. I'm not going to go really in depth in the geology, or we could be here for a very long time. So the first and probably most significant causatory type of event in Colorado was the uplift. And so that's the north-south uplift of the Rocky Mountains. And it's very stark and very much defines the western slope, starting with the Great Divide, just the landforms on that side, and then as a system you have the Great Plains to the east. So that, very important due to tectonics. Then we have some other issues that arose off of that. Then we have volcanism, not that kind of volcanism, but volcanoes. And a lot of that we've seen around here was a lot more recent than the uplift that gave us the Sangre de Cristos. Those events, obviously the biggest one, literally and figuratively, is the Spanish Peaks. So that was an event where magma, and Bob Kennemer is here to keep me honest about the difference between magma and lava. So lava's on the surface, magma is liquefied rock under the surface. So magma pushed up, but it never became lava, and pretty much just caused two giant bubbles, which became the Spanish Peaks. That's known as a volcanic stock. Silver Mountain, pretty much the same situation. Then of course we have the radial dikes, the rock walls that came out that was almost an extrusion or an injection of hard volcanic rock into the cracks that happened when these mountains were pushed up, these giant bubbles of magma were pushed up. And so a very interesting feature that we have here, probably the best example in the world of radial dikes and the way that they have formed, and just really unique. Sedimentology, so sandstone, of course, very important because as the mountains that get pushed up, the weathering forces start to weather them down. So you have erosion, first of all. You also have what they call mass wasting, which basically is just rocks rolling down the hill and causing areas that are lower to build up. So we get sandstone from that, so sedimentary rocks, sandstone obviously being the most important. You can look right out here, this beautiful Trinidad sandstone formation that runs just right along the front of the Sangre de Cristos. Made great, just excellent quarrying stone. So a lot of buildings around here were made out of this. And so, but another thing that was very important in sedimentology was our coal beds. And that's going to be very important later on as I talk about especially a lot of the development of things around here. Another really cool thing that we find in sedimentology is fossils. So preserved remains of ancient animals. And the fossil record is really neat too because it gives us a really good idea of, for one thing, kind of like archaeology, you have the stratigraphy. So you have a means to be able to date things by the differentiation of species inside the sedimentary rocks. So each of those types, very interesting. And metamorphic, that's a little bit more rare, but that is where volcanic pressure or heat has changed sedimentary rock. And I think the best example of that I can think of is when heat impacts limestone, it'll turn it into marble. And that's something that we have in several places, Monarch Pass, and then over on the very far north side of Gunnison County at the town of Marble, we have that. So that's a very classic example of a metamorphic rock. So I was talking about kind of the stark difference in Colorado between plains and mountains. So we have a very clear contrast with the plains out here and more or less mountains here. As you get further away from the main thrust of the uplift, we have more plateaus and mesas and mostly sedimentology type rocks over here. Think Monument Valley, think the monument in Grand Junction, that sort of thing. So that being said, we're kind of different from a few other states. One that comes kind of to mind is Montana. Even though a lot of Montana to the east is flat, they still have kind of these isolated ranges. From here, it's like east of I-25, we have a few little buttes here and there, but for the most part, very well defined kind of terrain that is definitely the plains. Something else we have here that's a little bit different too is we have what they call parks. Parks it was just a kind of a colloquial term that people coming here said, okay, we just came out in this big, wide, beautiful open area, and using what they knew, they said, well, it looks like a park, so we're going to call it a park. So North Park is up here, Middle Park out here, South Park out here, and then the San Luis Valley. So that is kind of the exception. Those areas more like the plains than the mountains, and but they've proved to be very good agricultural areas just because of the terrain. San Luis Valley, very famous for its potatoes, also for grain production and hay production. For hay production, North Park, just because of the high altitude, the North Park hay was very famous. They used to take it, export it all the way to Kentucky, and feed it to extremely good thoroughbred horses. So North Park hay was very famous, is very famous, just because of its high protein and that sort of thing. So one of the things that we see kind of developing because of the form of the land, we start to kind of identify barriers. So barriers in our development, and we start to put boundaries on things. Usually a physical barrier becomes a boundary. So in a lot of cases, if we look at, I'll kind of get a little ahead of myself, but we look at this edge of Orfano County, very irregular, and that is the barrier of the Sangre de Cristos, the Wet Mountains over here, Greenhorn, and that area. And it's also typically something that they could use a promontory, which is a divide between two basins or watersheds. It was very clear. It's like, okay, the water here, goes into the Rio Grande, the water here goes into the Arkansas, vice versa, sometimes between the French and the Spanish, it was kind of a question of whether we're talking about everything that goes into the Arkansas or we're just talking about the Arkansas. So the Louisiana Purchase, there was a little bit of a gray area, and so we actually fit into that gray area. The French saying, LaSalle stood at the mouth of the Mississippi and claimed everything that this river drains, and the Spanish were like, oh, no, the Arkansas is our boundary. So that was an area of contention. So on the other hand, we have avenues of approach. So avenues of approach are something that is kind of like the path of least resistance, but you also need to have resources as you're traveling these paths of least resistance. And rivers are really the most important that we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on when we talk more about boundaries and transportation. But we'll go ahead and talk about rivers. So rivers and obviously water, very important to Colorado and really to the nation. So the rivers coming off of Colorado has been called the roof of the nation. And what does the roof do? It splits the waters, it sheds the waters, and that's kind of what Colorado does. It's also been called the mother of rivers because of all the major rivers that start here. And I think there's 22 downriver states from us that actually see water from Colorado. So it's very significant, all of the water that goes down. So I'll go ahead and graph the major rivers. So this makes it pretty easy because the North Platte starts in North Park, goes up into Wyoming. The South Platte, very important for the Denver area and also for the early settlement of Denver in that area, goes out at about that kind of angle. The Rio Grande, of course, starts over here, comes out of the San Luis Valley, goes pretty much splits New Mexico in half, becomes international boundary between us and Mexico. Over here you have the Colorado River, which you have the Yampa and the Green up here. You have the San Juan down in this area, but they all end up going eventually to the Colorado, and the Colorado going out at the Sea of Cortez on the west coast of Mexico, and essentially very easy to discern because that is everything that is drained to the Pacific. And so when we talk about that, we talk about the Great Divide, and everything on that, the west side of the Great Divide goes that way. So our rivers have a great disadvantage over a lot of the rivers back east, being that they are not navigable, except maybe if you're past Canal. Anybody know? Bob? Past Canal? If you're past Canal with his canoe going up the South Platte. Centennial, yes. So James Michener's grand opus of the American West Centennial. So past Canal was a French fur trapper that made trips from St. Louis up to about where Greeley is founded. That was the original fictionalized town of Centennial. So then you get to come up and get yourself, after the fact,
thank you.
You get to come up and dig through the treasures. These avenues of approach from the very beginning, obviously water. Even though it's not navigable, as you're coming in, you need water for yourself, you need water for your animals, you also need pasture for your animals. So the floodplains of these rivers, and of course back then these rivers were not encumbered by reservoirs or anything like that, so they had a very clear flood cycle, and they had a very clear floodplain, which more nutrients from the mountains and rich soil came down and covered the floodplains, and of course then made very good pasture to pasture your oxen, that sort of thing on. And of course trees grow on it, so you have fuel for fires and that sort of thing. So of course these were the earliest trade and migratory routes by the American Indians. They developed trails along here because obviously they followed the game. They also followed seasonal changes, and the rivers just made great early trails, and then eventually developed into roads, and then settlement location once Anglo and Hispanic settlement started to really occur in this area. Something that we see is kind of different is that eventually the interstate highway system finally kind of overcame this context because you're not so reliant on water and that sort of thing, you're more reliant on loves. So that kind of, and of course the idea with the interstate highway system was that instead of all these twisty little lines that follow rivers and that sort of thing, you got straight lines being the shortest distance between 2 points. Also, they tried to keep the interstate highway system under 6% grade. Some of the things they had to do were very interesting. Eisenhower Tunnel, for instance, instead of going over level of the pass, the Glenwood Canyon, all the roads that were lifted up onto viaducts there, and then we have the Columbia House Hill. So if those of you that are local know what I'm saying about the Columbia House Hill, and that was a 6% grade, so that was about the max that they could do and still get under this idea for keeping the interstate highways fairly flat. At this point too, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about, again, a downside of not having navigable rivers, but it also kind of caused other development. So back east, they have navigable rivers. Then to connect the country, they started building canals, and because the terrain and also the more plentiful water allowed the building of these canals, they were able to connect the great rivers, connect the Great Lakes, and use that. So out here, we had to find something a little bit different, and so that really developed railroads. So railroads were kind of that more efficient method of transport. So when you're transporting something, you need to seek the greatest amount of efficiency. And of course, with a canal, a lot of those canals, like the Erie Canal, you have one horse, you'd have a 80-ton cargo barge, but because it was floating, that it was holding weight, you have one horse that was just pulling 80 tons. So they were trying to achieve greater efficiency, and out here it really developed to railroads, and significantly for Colorado, the narrow gauge railroad, because the narrow gauge railroad could make steeper grades, it could take more extreme radius of curves to get places, and that was what General Palmer, that was the founder of Colorado Springs, that was his company, and he did very well making it into these mining camps very early on and taking supplies in, bringing ore out. So again, that's efficiency because you're going loaded both ways. So that's kind of brings us to this map over here. So, and as I think most of you will recognize, that's Huerfano County. So not Huerfano County, and definitely not Huerfano County, Huerfano County. So a very interesting kind of story about that. The very first Anglo maps of the area had that identified as Wharf Creek, and that was the Anglos hearing the Hispanics and saying, well, I just don't know what that means. Maybe it means that there's a dock at the end of the creek or something. And so if you look at old maps of where the Huerfano goes into the Arkansas, it's called Wharf Creek. So I contend that the county of Huerfano is the coolest shaped Colorado county. So others are very much just squares and blobs, but I think ours is kind of like a backwards China. You have your Manchuria up here, Cantonese coast down here. But anyway, so I would take anyone on a debate or a physical fight that says that Huerfano County is not the coolest shaped county in Colorado. So the reason for this, and I touched on it briefly, is that it's based more on natural boundaries than any other county in Colorado. And I talked about parallels and meridians, basically latitude and longitude. So a lot of the counties are shaped based on artificial straight lines. Like I said, our county is based on the divide between, on this side, Muddy Creek and Grape Creek. On the big side, between the Arkansas and the Rio Grande. Let me get my blue rivers that we have is, we have the rivers, and including rivers that aren't in our county, like the Purgatory and the Pishipaw, come up kind of at a southwest and northeast angle. And so even the straight lines in our county are based on points that are more or less delineating the barriers or the the boundaries rather between these rivers. So if you'll notice, these aren't necessarily even level, as it were, lines, but that is why, you know, even the more angular part of our county is still more based on natural boundaries than kind of human-made artificial boundaries. So Colorado was one of the 17 original counties. Previously, you know, I talked about how Colorado was made up of all of these other parts of other territories. When it was the area called the New Mexico Notch, initially it was actually in Taos County, and then because counties are based on population, that when you get a certain population, other counties are able to be created out of an area. Then we were in Mora County following an increase in population, and I believe it was about 1862, we came into our colonial territorial capitals or county seats, and so it's really telling, you know, that Los Animas, which is the present largest county, was actually carved out of Warford County entirely in 1866. Of course, Warford County is named after Warford Butte, so its namesake, an ancient landmark, and it was a very good landmark because it really delineated north, south, and east and west. North-south trails at that point were following the front of the Rocky Mountains, and of course the Warfano River and the Warfano Basin, Sangre de Cristo Pass, Mackinac Pass, Moscow Pass, those were all lower passes that were easily accessible. The Utes, a lot of times, you know, I mentioned there was a lot of seasonality. They traveled over those passes to leave the San Luis Valley for the winter, very smart. The Hispanic sheepmen followed that example later on. So the Taos Trail, of course, connected the Arkansas and Bent's Fort, and the trading networks that went all the way to St. Louis connected it to Taos. So that was a very important route. So coming back just to kind of the whole picture of Warford County, the highest point is Mount Blanca, 14,700 or 373 feet, fifth largest or fifth highest point in Colorado. Then the lowest point in the county is where the Caceres River leaves the county, and that is 4,841 feet. So a total relief of 9,532 feet. So tremendous amount of elevational relief between those 2 points. So interesting also that I thought I'd mention at this point, from where we're standing right here at 7,013 feet to the top of the West Peak, 13,636 feet, we have a relief difference of 6,623 feet in just about 10 miles. So an incredible amount of elevation difference there. Something that really promotes in our county is biological diversity. So we have everything from alpine ecosystems above timberline all the way down to Sonoran desert ecosystems down in the lower reaches of the county. So my dad was a forester with the State Forest Service and was also just a very well-trained biologist, and he always claimed it was the most diverse Colorado county, and mainly because of just this great variance of ecosystems. And I don't think anybody really can argue with that. If they do, they can go out and start counting species and birds and that sort of thing. And that's another thing, is that we have a very good position kind of, again, along the front of the mountain, so we have migratory birds that come and go as well. So the Spanish Peaks, Silver Mountain, the dikes, Mount Mistis, I mentioned that they're a lot younger than the main Sangres. And something a lot of people don't realize when they come here is that the Spanish Peaks are a separate mountain range. A lot of people suppose that they are part of the Sangres, but they're like 140 million years younger, so a lot more recent development because of the volcanism that we talked about earlier. Then we have a volcanism that happened in geologic terms, you know, between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago. You know, in geologic terms, that's like yesterday. So the area, the buttes on the south side of the San Luis Valley, Fisher's Peak,
Capulin volcano. All of them were very, very recent events. And Black Mesa, which is actually the highest point in Oklahoma, which is about that far from Colorado, but it actually has a very, very distinct kind of formation of being known as an inverted valley. So it was a valley in sedimentary rock. When the volcanoes that formed Fisher's Peak, the Mesa de Maya, all of that area were going, it filled up a valley with lava. Then all of the softer sedimentary rock went away, and same thing with Fisher's Peak. You had that lava protecting the softer materials under it. So as far as the extent of that lava remained protected by that layer, and everything else went away. So you know, it's just a very interesting kind of perspective to look at how even more recent things. I mean, the mountains are really old, but in relation to each other, Spanish Peaks and some of these other volcanic mountains, much, much younger. Something that the mountains have an effect that we have on our weather. The biggest weather pattern that we see from them is something they call the rain shadow effect. And if you've ever traveled the stretch from Walsenburg to La Junta on Highway 10, you see what the rain shadow effect is. So it collects all the moisture that's coming from our predominant weather patterns, which come from the Pacific. We do get Gulf moisture, and I'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute, but that rain shadow effect takes the water and condenses it on the mountains, then warmer, drier air comes down off the west side, or the east side in this case, and forms essentially a desert. So another important weather pattern that we have here is the stationary Albuquerque low. So that means when a low pressure system sits over Albuquerque, stationary, it scoops moisture-laden air off of the Gulf of Mexico, comes around, and then when it hits the barrier of the Spanish Peaks, drops snow, drops snow, drops snow. And if anybody remembers Thanksgiving 1997, when the snow was about 5 feet tall, that was a classic effect. We just kept waiting for it to go away, but it was like a conveyor belt of moisture that just came transporting that moist Gulf of Mexico air up into the into our area, and then just once it hit the Spanish Peaks, they just were acting like a dam, just squeezing that moisture out. So, okay. So, anybody have any questions at this point? Doing pretty well on time. I told Jamie I keep it under 4 hours. And then I said, you know, give me the keys and I'll lock up. But so no, I think we're doing good. So a lot to cover, because you know I wanted to really address a lot of our history and just the way these kind of geospatial contexts led to our development to where we are today. So we talked about the migration and settlement patterns, and to go back to the earliest human habitation, we go back to the tribal domains. And for a very long time, the development that was sedentary was pretty much confined to the Four Corners area. The ancestral Puebloans, they're also called the Anasazi. That is a Navajo term which implies that they're bad people. It means ancient enemy, and so that has really fallen out of favor. And then kind of on the opposite side, ancestral Puebloans, they have made the connection between that's what happened to those people, was that they moved from the canyon areas to the river valleys, to the Rio Grande Valley in particular, and made that transition. And then archaeology and paleontology has really demonstrated this by tracing the kind of the threads of their material culture. And the material culture, mainly architecture, so we can trace the development there. Pottery, basketry, so this happened probably around 1200. And we know from dendrochronology, which is following climatic changes in tree rings, we know that there was a very drying time, so they were faced with climate change effects. There were also social upheavals, and when I talk about the Navajo, I'll talk more about them. So they moved from the desert canyons of the southwestern part of the state, the Four Corners area, to places like the San Juan River and the Rio Grande, where they had a very reliable flow of water. And
later when I talk a little bit about general cultural developments of civilizations, rivers play a huge part of that. So I was talking about the Navajo, and the Navajos, they believe, were a very recent group that crossed the land bridge as recently as 3,000 years ago. And there are definitely more cultural and even racial features of them. The Navajos are very distinct, and the people that crossed, they were called the Nadine. And like I said, about 3,000 years ago, they came from Asia. A group of them stayed in the interior of Alaska and became the Athabascans. By about 1300 and 1400 AD, there was a southern group of Athabascans that came down, and that tribe came down and pretty much surrounded the Pueblo valleys. So they were in the area above all of the Tano, Carician, the various Pueblo groups. So their name in their language is Dene, and their area of operations, as it were, their homeland was called Deneta, and the four mountains, obviously the one that we know about is Wonga Peak, but Mount Taylor down close to Gallup, New Mexico is another one, Hesperus over by Durango, and then the Francisco Peaks, which are just outside of Flagstaff, were their four sacred mountains, and pretty much delineated Deneta, which was their area of influence. So in our area, we are really familiar with the Utes, and the Utes were known as the mountain people, also the people of the Shining Mountains. To themselves, they were known as the Nuns, and the Nuns meant primary people in the Uto-Aztecan language, and you might say Uto-Aztecan. So that's very interesting because the Uto-Aztecan groups in our area, they were just what we call the Utes. On the west side, all the way as far as Nevada and even as far as Death Valley, they were known as the Paiutes. And the Paiutes were a little bit more sedentary than our Utes, which were very nomadic. In the northwest, there's the Goshutes, and the Goshutes actually mixed with the Shoshone, so they were a little bit more of a mixed people, so they had kind of their own culture and beliefs. But the Utes originated, as near as anyone can tell, in the Gila River Basin, so southern Arizona. And from there, they spread north and east. And when they got so far north, they impacted the Shoshone and intermarried with them to some extent. They went west until they got to Death Valley and pretty much the limit of human habitation. And then, of course, expanded north into what is now Utah, and Utah being the only state that's named after a Native American tribe. So, not a very good consolation prize for everything they lost, but we'll talk about that a little bit too. But very interestingly enough, a group of these Utes split off and moved down through New Mexico, and obviously as they went further south, they got into the Chihuahuan Desert. Things were very bad, and so the story goes that as they moved south, they went to their medicine man, and he said, "I don't think I'm going to make this trip. I'm too old, and I just can't make it." But we're being harried by these other people. The Comanche, the Apache, some of the other tribes in the area were harassing them. They were trying to find a home, and he said, "Just go south until you see a cactus. On the cactus, there'll be an eagle eating a snake." Talk about specific instructions. So they went, and finally one day they got into some better country. They started to run into some other more sedentary types of tribes, and they looked out on this island, and sure enough, exactly as they had been predicted, they saw the eagle eating a snake on a cactus. And so they said, well, that's where we're going to go. And that became the core of Mexico City and the Aztec Empire. So very interesting, that the Aztecs and the Utes are related. But it's really interesting. And the other thing I was going to say about the Navajo and the Athabascans, when I was in the National Guard, I drilled out of Durango, and our unit there was about 60% Navajo. and this young Navajo woman came, and she'd been in the regular army, and she'd been up at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, and she got to know some of the natives there. And she went to a party, and she walked in the room, and they're talking, and suddenly they stop, and then they start talking in English. And she said, well, why'd you stop talking? And they said, well, we didn't want to speak our language in front of you, not understand. And she said, but I did understand. It sounded weird, but I understood. She said, it's kind of like a Cajun talking to a New Yorker, but I can make it out. And so even with all these intervening centuries, the Navajo and the Athabascans still share that linguistic similarity all the way from Arizona to Alaska. So, so there was a lot more permanent migration than we think. Cultural groups. Trade was huge, of course, among the tribal peoples. The Plains tribes, when the horse came, that was a huge change for them because they became a horse culture. The first ones to get the horse from the Spanish were the Comanche, and they were able to dominate the plains of West Texas, eastern New Mexico, all the way up into Colorado. The Utes were the second to get the horses. Of course, their area was they were more or less confined, not confined, but their home was the mountains. So they did not travel as widely, but the introduction of the horse to the Utes did make their lives a lot easier. So firearms made a huge difference. The Spanish were very strict about gun control, and they said we don't want them getting guns, especially the Comanche and the French, in order to undermine the Spanish authority in New Mexico. As the French came up the Missouri River, they were like, oh yeah, you don't like the Spanish, you like to steal their animals? Here's some guns. And so they were hoping that they would not use the guns on them, that they would go, and they did raid the Spanish quite significantly throughout the 1600s and 1700s. Large teepees were something that the Plains tribes were able to develop. Before they'd had dogs and travois that went behind the dogs, but they just could not carry a whole lot. And the Cheyenne and Arapaho, they moved more into especially the northern plains. 1779, De Anza defeated Cuerna Verde, who Greenhorn is named after, and was able to not destroy, but lessen their power, especially their power to strike the villages of eastern and central New Mexico. So the Arapaho took that as kind of a power vacuum, and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, who were a little bit further north, came in to the plains of eastern Colorado in the early 1800s. And like I said, the bigger teepees, they were able to trade a lot more. But they got into this area, was really interesting because the Utes had kind of a monopoly on lodgepole. So you think about trying to be out on the plains and trying to make a teepee out of, cottonwood. Not going to happen. So lodgepole is obviously almost perfect for that. But then think about, being a tribe that, was more reliant on deer and small game versus, the Arapaho have these beautiful big buffalo hides. So you get together and we give you poles, we give you hides. So, definitely one of those mutually advantageous trade relationships. So, moving on to settlement patterns, we're going to talk about several different kinds of settlement patterns. So, in southern Colorado, we're really known as the borderlands. And the reason for this is, like I was mentioning, the Spanish were on one side, initially the French, but then bought by the American colonies with the, it was the U.S. by then, the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, a little redundant there, but that was, that brought the United States into the area. So we'll address the difference in these settlement patterns. So something I like to say from the very get-go about the difference between Anglo and Hispanic systems was that the Anglo seemed to be more about democratic ideals. The South, maybe not so much. They were more of like a colonial plantation society, and we see the Civil War happened as a result of that. But the Hispanic system was much more feudal. So it was much more based in medieval Europe, where you had systems of peasants, you had systems of nobles, And that was kind of the system that the Hispanic colonial thrust was really trying to promote in the Americas. But we'll go with the Anglo system. So we had East Coast colonies. We had farming, cotton, indigo, tobacco, rice, etc. The tribes were driven off of their lands there, further west, and initially it was just inland. But then as the colonies became the United States, they were a lot of times forced into Indian territory, which became Oklahoma. So you had people all the way from Florida all the way to upstate New York. You had everybody from the Creek to the Delawares all being sent to Oklahoma. So that was kind of their pattern, was that we're based on European families. We're driving the savages out ahead of us and bringing civilization. The idea was that we're democratic, we have democratic ideals, we don't like the feudal system, we don't like monarchism, and the idea that Thomas Jefferson really perpetuated was the yeoman farmer. So rugged individualism, again, democracy, that sort of thing. Of course, the South a little bit different because it was a plantation system, the use of indentures or black slaves, and of course that was not something that either one, was just not sustainable or humane for those very reasons. So I won't belabor that concept, but that's very familiar in what I call the Eastern-centric U.S. histories. So a lot of what we probably came up with from school reading, very, very much about the colonies and the Boston Tea Party and that sort of thing, and didn't really cover the whole Hispanic colonial system. And I think the real eye-opener for me was when I was 7 years old, and my grandma took me to Santa Fe, and we went to the Palace of Governors, and it's a nice, big, impressive building, and she says, this building was here a decade and a half before the Pilgrims got to Plymouth Rock. And that's just kind of mind-blowing, because you get this very Eastern-centric view of U.S. history. And so that was something that, made me question, what are the relationships? What are the boundaries? What are the boundaries of influence? The narratives of the dominant culture. We have all these big colleges back east that are pushing this sort of narrative. So going into the Hispanic colonial system, this is very much affected by the events in Spain in right around 1492. So we probably will recognize that date. Right before that happened, there was the unification. So Spain was about 6 different kingdoms. The 2 most powerful kingdoms were Aragon and Castile. And the rulers, of course, recognize this too from those that sent Columbus, were Ferdinand and Isabella. They were called their Catholic majesties. So a lot of their power was derived from the Catholic Church. And one of the main things that they did was defeating Granada, which was the Muslim and Moorish kingdom in the south. And once they did that and got them out of there, their Catholic majesties worked on the expulsion of the Jews. And nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Does anybody expect the Spanish Inquisition? Do you? Right, good. So anyway, so they used the Spanish Inquisition to expel the Jews. A lot of them were able to leave, and a lot of them became what we call the crypto-Jews in the Southwest. They hid their religion, or another example was a lot of them, because the Habsburgs were in power, one of the cousins of the Habsburg king was in charge of lands in Lithuania and Poland, and a lot of them were expelled to Northern Europe also. So suddenly we have peace in Spain, we have a unified Spain. There was a group of people, we call it the Hidalgo class. The Hidalgos were knights, they were minor nobility, they were really good at what they were doing, and what they've been doing for centuries was fighting the Moors. And suddenly they didn't have anybody to fight, and you'd get these, macho men running around the countryside, armed to the teeth, and they became really what we call the conquistadors. So the conquistadors, along with especially the Franciscans, came, and their goal in the New World was to civilize, Catholicize, and Hispanicize. So they wanted to enact a system where they're basically rebuilding Spain. And this system was called the viceroyalty system. So a viceroy, like vice president, royalty, rey in Spanish is king. So basically the vice king was in charge of whatever viceroyalty you were in. So he was kind of a secondary king. In the Americas, we saw, of course, Mexico. There was a very thriving empire there, started by those proto-Utes that became the Aztecs. Of course, Cortez was able to take over that. I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. Peru, the Inca, Pizarro was able to take over there. And so then there was this idea of Mexico was so rich, there's got to be something else. And there's got to be a new Mexico. So we want to go find that new Mexico. And of course, Coronado was sent. They did not find the great riches that they found in Peru and Mexico, but that was really the establishment of New Mexico. So the colonization of New Mexico, I'll make a quick detour. I warned you about how river-based civilizations, as far as material culture and their staying power. I'll start with Egypt, and we talked about big rivers and how rivers with their floodplains before they're encumbered by reservoirs. Each year there's a renewal of the agricultural lands. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. So between the Tigris and Euphrates, same sort of thing. Warm areas, rich soil, plentiful water. And so once you have those, that combination, suddenly you have agriculture, and then you have agricultural surplus. And once you have agricultural surplus, that means you can move into trade, and trade with your neighbors, whoever your neighbors are. So that the stretch is going to be Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Rio Grande Pueblos. But I love, in just theoretical history to see if the Pueblos had been continued to develop, what kind of a civilization they would have become. Of course, once you're sedentary, you can develop a lot of fine arts, especially the pottery, the basketry, the weavings. They became more and more exhibited greater craftsmanship and intricacies. So really interesting as far as that went. The problem was, especially with the Pueblos, was that the benefits of their civilization also became their greatest detriment because they were easily conquered. And it's almost exactly like you think of a pyramid scheme. You have control at the top, and it proved true with the Inca and the Aztec, that you had a stratified society with nobles at the top, minor nobles, military leaders, then peons, agricultural people down below. And so if you go in and knock off the guy at the top, you can just move right into his house. Montezuma, looking at you, Cortez just moved into his house and was able to take that over. So unfortunately, because of their civilization, as it were, the Pueblos were very easily defeated by the Spanish. The Spanish were able to come in and say, hey, we're here, this is our God, meet our God, you've met our God, build us this church, we're going to eat your food, we're going to teach you, a whole new system. So that was a very difficult time for the Pueblos, even though I mentioned before there's different, especially linguistic differences. The Tano, the Parisian, the Tiwa, they're different linguistic groups. Their modes of civilization and their arts were very similar. And they were able to unite under a guy named Pope that was from San Juan Pueblo in 1680, and he was able to form a coalition, and they were able to kick out the Spanish for about 20 years. And so they were able to do that, but then eventually the Spanish were just able to come back in and retake New Mexico in about the 1690s. So the Spanish and the Hidalgos especially believed in a caste system. And again, this goes back to kind of this feudal idea. Very racially based. At the top you had what were called peninsulares. So peninsulares mean that they're born on the Iberian Peninsula, which is obviously Spain and Portugal. Next you had Criollos. Criollos, you have the word Creole, which in this case meant people of Spanish descent but were born here. The next rung on the ladder, more or less, was mestizos, and mestizo being a mix of American Indian and Spanish. You had a whole bunch of other kind of terms or steps. One is zambo, which means somebody of Spanish and African descent, and then Chino. And you've probably heard of Chino, California. And we don't really think about it too much, but the Spanish had a vast worldwide trade network, and they had done colonization in the Indochina area, and of course the Philippines is the big example. So obviously not too many people that fit into that, but they used this caste system based on race to stratify people. And you couldn't move up. If you married down, that was very much looked upon, looked down upon. And something that happened in New Mexico, a group called the Genizaro, it's very tragically little known, was the Spanish hierarchy trying to create kind of a peasant class. So when the tribes that were fighting made raids against each other, they would capture children, and they would take those children and sell them into pretty much slavery with the Spanish, and the Spanish would take away all their culture, mainly their language, and then marry them off to each other. So they didn't have any really clear tribal identity anymore, and then these towns were, they were set out almost like a buffer. So a lot of the villages in New Mexico were peopled by this Genizaro class, and they fringed the main centers, and obviously Santa Fe being the main center. But these villages had small farms. There was a lot of subsistence farming, but this is a place that you might run into Pacheco's pig. Anybody run into Pacheco's pig?
Oh.
Peggy?
I know it. Ah, she's going to kill it.
Milagro.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Mary, you come up and claim your prize. So yes, so this was a pig in Milagro in a mythologized story about a water grab by John Nichols. And this pig ran rampant amongst the town. So the Spanish also had the Spanish land grant system. We hear about that quite a bit, and that stands in contrast to what the U.S. had, which was the home rule. So again, we're going back to that more feudal society where you have large grants of land, you have whatever caste you're in, and you're bound to remain that, whether you're a peon or whether you might be a little higher craftsman. You might be at the top and be a landowner. So the Spanish land grant system was implemented in New Mexico, and then, of course, like I said, spilled into what was in the New Mexico Notch versus the Homestead Act, which, again, supported this idea of the union farm. So in the San Luis Valley, sheep raising became very, very commonplace on the Mexican land grants. Weaving had developed with the introduction of the sheep. The Navajo especially had just made it into a high art form, so you talk about your fine art. So sheep raising, yeah, very important, and that also had kind of a effect on Morfeo County, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in the first Hispanic movements into this county. But I want to now talk about mining as a colonial system, and this is something that you wouldn't really think about, but again, this book and just the thesis that there was instant urban development that followed the mining. So mining was something that you would have a certain synergy, because you bring all these people, you had high demand, they needed to eat, so farmers would have to come in to supply the mines, and so you did have this kind of synergy developing in the mining towns. So once a mining town happened, first thing they had to have was a newspaper, because they needed good press. And so they needed somebody not only to build up their mining town and how promising everything was, and how many ounces per ton everything's testing at, and how they're attracting all the best miners, but then also to badmouth the town down the road that was their rival. And then the next thing they needed was an opera house. And so they might take the biggest tent they could find and put a fake front on it, and then and call that the opera house. But then, in some cases, like in Leadville, they actually eventually did build an opera house. But that is a perfect example of a Potemkin village. Anyone? Potemkin village? Potemkin village.
Sergei Eisenstein.
What was that?
Sergei Eisenstein did the movie.
Right. So do you know who the actual guy was? So Gregory Potemkin was a minister and also lover of Catherine the Great. And when they took the Crimea from the Tartars, he wanted to show how beautifully things were progressing, and they weren't progressing beautifully. So he made all these facades of villages, and then he hired people to stand in front of them and act happy as she rode through in her carriage. And so the Potemkin village was a false front. And so a lot of these mining towns, that's what it was. It was kind of a Potemkin village. They're like, okay, we've got staying power. You know, we're just going to keep on booming. We're not going to go bust. And there were, like Leadville's an example, Cripple Creek to some extent, they were able to have some staying power, but that was the kind of the difference between the mining types. So there's placer mining and lode mining. So placer mining is looking for free gold. So free gold basically meaning that it's free and it's out there. So it is gold that has left the solid rock. Erosion and alluvial forces have brought it down the creeks, and you can go out and you can pan for it and sluice for it. So that is where gold was usually initially found. So in Denver, it was found in Cherry Creek. It was very interesting because the Georgians that were on their way to California said, hey, this looks good, maybe we'll come back for this later. And so they did, like some of Larry's relatives. But then once that was used up, there's only so much gold you can find in the alluvium that's washed down from the mountains. You have to keep following the color, as they say. So you go up and you find the lode. So the lode is the actual veins. And then it becomes much more expensive because then you have to excavate, you have further to take it, you have to process the ore, so you have to first crush the ore, then you have to either use a chemical amalgamation or use heat to release that gold from the rock. So there was kind of those changes that took place for mining towns. And if they could make that transition from being just a placer gold, free gold, you're out there just picking it off the ground, to actually becoming to hard rock mining, as they say, that was when if they could make that transition, they became successful. So at this point, I want to kind of consider some of the consequences of geospatial features and contexts, resources and distances. That's something I've talked about. You can only ship something so far, especially inefficiently, before it loses its value. So finding more efficiency, finding better transportation methods and routes was very important to development. Something that we see in this county that was huge. Everybody happy? Okay. I want to do kind of a study of the towns of our county, but I'd like to a little bit talk about some of these, how if you were in the right position, development could really come easy. And sometimes it wasn't so easy. But one of the best examples for this area was coal to CF&I. So CF&I was in a good spot for manufacturing. They had the Arkansas River, so they had lots of water. Even today, you come by Stem Beach, that big reservoir was built for water for CF&I. You go right past the headquarters of CF&I, you see that big canal right there. Just to the south of town, we have limestone. So when you go through like Burt Mill Road, there was actually a town there called Lime. And so the lime that was used, I think was used for fluxing. I might not be correct on that. Anyone know what the lime was used for? It was used in the process of steel production. Over here on the other side of Levine Pass, you had iron mines. So there was all of these, again, synergies that were greater than the sum of their parts. And in our county, the coal, mainly because of, like I was talking about, these sedimentary layers, for a long time this was a shallow sea on this side of the mountains, and a lot of places when the uplift happened, it exposed these organic layers that through time, pressure, and heat had become coal seams. And the uplift lifted it up, and the mines were able to just follow those coal seams right down into the strata of geology. So in that case, a lot of development happened. It happened quickly. Lots of human abuses, environmental abuses, but again, it really came down to the things that were building the West. And talk about mainly railroads. I mean, that was huge. The railroads that were bringing the ore to the smelters, and then also taking supplies. And then, of course, once you had a railroad, there were efforts to colonize, towns like Center, Mosca, of course, the Mormons that came into the valley, Manasseh, Hooper, those towns that were set up as kind of agricultural colonies. But you had the railroad, and the railroad it came for the mining, but it stayed for the agriculture. So that really helped with the development of that. So in our local communities, we can kind of observe some of these geospatial contexts at work. I'm just going to more or less assume that everyone knows. So Veta, Gardner, Walsenburg, kind of their spaces in our county. Starting out with Gardner, originally a Hispanic settlement called Chavez Town. And I talked about the Hispanic sheep herders that had come for the land grants that were mainly in the San Luis Valley. They realized it got darn cold there in the winter. And the Archuleta family especially were big sheep growers. They realized it was much better to come over the mountain, and suddenly it's 40 degrees instead of minus 40. So that's a huge difference. So in that area, I'm going to hit the high spots, not oversimplify too much or expound too much. So Chavez Town, unfortunately, it was built on rich soil along the Warford River, but the Warford River got it because in those days there was not really an idea of being able to levee up a river, or there certainly wasn't at that point any reservoirs or anything that would prevent that. And a downside of sheep grazing, sheep do what they call close grazing. So they really graze close, and they cause more and more runoff. So Chavez Town was wiped out. Herbert Gardner, he was the son of Massachusetts governor. There's a Gardner, Massachusetts. So if you ever thought about why there might be a Gardner, Colorado and a Gardner, Massachusetts, something that he did that was very significant, other than lend his name to, or bequeath his name to Gardner, was that he bought melon seeds back east, and he wanted to grow melons out here, but he didn't figure that he could quite do it up this high, but he gave them to his buddy George Swink. And George Swink, obviously, they worked for him, so Rocky Ford melons, boom. So that worked out. Going on to Walsenburg. Walsenburg, obviously, at a perfect crossroads. Again, it was kind of like where the Wharf and Butte is, but of course they have the Cacheros River instead of the Wharfano, but still, you had this very used, ancient path that went along the front of the Rockies. You had access over the mountains into the San Luis Valley and the San Juans and that whole area. Irrigation was possible. The Leones and Atencios, the first settlers that started, and it was called Plaza de los Leones, and the Atencios started the very first ditches in Walsenburg, and were able to start up high and just kind of ease the ditch up the sides of the hills and do as much irrigation as possible. And then Fred Walson moved in as a merchant and banker. One of the things that he did that was very savvy was he staked a lot of the Hispanic sheep herders. So he would buy them good sheep for breeding stock, and he would take 1/2 of the lamb crop every year. And they ended up with better product, and he ended up with lots of money. He ended up having a ranch west of, well, actually about halfway between Levita and Walsenburg. If you know where the Valley Road crosses the railroad tracks right before it hits 160, that was Walson's ranch. The rumor is that he had developed irrigation ditches there, and Walsenburg, because it was developing because of the coal, needed water, and he said, hey, you can have this ditch if you name the town after me. So again, a rural legend, I don't know if it's true, but the coal seams, again, the coal seams were fairly easy to get at, and just extensive layers of coal, hundreds and hundreds of linear miles of coal mines, and even under the town of Walsenburg. So La Veta, last but not least, we have La Veta Pass, and that I think was very key to the development here, because La Veta Pass, and even today, you have, it's the only paved road for 166 miles. So from Poncha Springs all the way to Red River, that's the only paved road. So that's almost unheard of in the continental United States. So, and of course, like I said, we had the railroad, they went in for the mining, they continued to profit from the agriculture and development of San Luis Valley, and so that was really huge. Something very interesting that I've never done, but I've tried to my whole life, is from our ranch on Middle Creek, I can walk out my back door and walk to the New Mexico state line and never cross a road. I crossed the railroad once, and of course I'd have to stay on the ridge of the Calabria Mountains the whole way, so probably be about a 2-week trip, but that just gives you kind of the idea of how that was a barrier. It still is a barrier, and also just the importance of Highway 160 and the way, you know, it followed the railroad, and of course we still have the railroad, but the narrow gauge initially went up La Veta Pass, and at that time it was the highest railroad in the whole world. And so it just shows, you know, that, you know, it's supply and demand. If there's a need to move materials, you know, they're going to figure it out. Also, one of the great things about La Veta, I talked about the Spanish Peaks acting as a catch basin for moisture. The location of La Veta, just a little bit west of town, Middle Creek merges with south of Veta and Indian Creek, and then, you know, as you come into town, you've got all these beautiful fields out here. Right where we are is a floodplain where the Gutierrez River, over the eons, went back and forth all over what we're standing on, what La Veta was built on. And so if you dig, you know, even 3 or 4 feet down, you're going to find river rock. But above that is all this nice, rich soil. And of course, Francisco, when he built his plaza, which you can look out the window here and see, and first and oldest building in La Veta, he was right in the middle of it. And he said, "This is paradise enough for me." So with that, I will open it to questions. What's that?
You answered it all.
Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, Jim.
You spoke mostly of physical barriers and physical motivation. How about the narrative or mindset? For example, Manifest Destiny. Would you speak to the extent that affected
Sure,
cultural movement?
sure. And, you know, I talked a little bit about the Homestead Act, and, you know, the idea, especially among the poorer immigrants of Europe, that they wanted, you know, land ownership in, you know, medieval Europe. You know, that was the nobles. The nobles owned everything. The peasants worked the land. You could never leave your class and that sort of thing. So with Manifest Destiny, that was kind of this extension of, you know, you can come to the United States, you know, with nothing, and you can develop something. But you know, the idea was that to do that, you had to get the people out, and the biggest draw was, you know, free land, but you had to go out 7 years to prove it up. Another thing that was an incentive that not a lot of people know about was that when a railroad came through, the government would cede them half the land on 20 miles to each side of the railroad. And in Wyoming especially, that's where they get these lands called checkerboards. So that remained in the public domain became usually BLM land. What was given to the railroads, they sold it off to farmers. And in a lot of cases, they would, you know, intentionally look to certain groups and whatever, especially a good example is grain farmers. And they would get Scandinavians and Germans because they figured, oh, these are good, hardworking folks. They want their own land. We'll get them out here, get them on the land, get them producing, and then we've got the railroad, we've got the grain elevators, so we can, you know, derive a certain amount of efficiency, you know, from the system.
So was the Manifest Destiny, did it incorporate a rationale by which we are God's soldiers, and they incorporated that narrative as a rationale for wiping out the indigenous population?
Yeah, I would say that maybe not the advertised word, but you know, the idea that you know, a U.S. from coast to coast, and I didn't talk about, you know, the Mexican-American War, Guadalupe Hidalgo, and some of those developments, because we'd be here another hour. But that'd be a whole nother talk. But yes, so there was that push, and the idea was that, again, I was talking about how especially the English idea was that you make a beachhead, the colonies, you push in from there, you fight the French, you buy out or chase out the Dutch, and you send the Indians to Oklahoma, and just, yeah, so it kind of comes back to that as far as just a mindset, kind of a pattern of settlement. Yeah, Tom.
About what date was Chavez grazing sheep in Gardner? Was it well before 1862?
That would have been, they're not exactly sure when the town washed away. I'd have to do more research on that.
Okay.
But it was probably it would have to be post 1854 and, yeah, so
Okay,
late
around that.
1850s,
But
early
not
1850s.
real long before,
60s.
but before.
Yeah, yeah.
A little piece of trivia if you're interested.
Okay.
There's only one other place in the world that uses the same grammatic structure as Navajo,
Oh, yeah.
and that's in the Ural Mountains.
Wow. Yeah, and a very interesting thing about some of the ethnic people in Japan, they believe that for a long time, the ice sheet, that was kind of like our mountains, that the ice sheet, when it was retreating from the last ice age, that was just a major east-west route. And so I can definitely see that from the Urals to the east, they could have been moving along that. So that's a very good point. Thanks. Yeah,
Are you familiar with a tribal reservation in the late 1800s called Greenwood? That was in eastern Orfano County. I believe it was Cheyenne, Arapaho, and maybe Apache.
Okay, I'm not, so was that the original configuration of Orphan
Well,
Academy?
I was curious.
Yeah,
if
I
that
imagine
is,
it.
the far east, right, like Los
Yeah.
Animas County, but from what I understand, it was like, it lasted for 4 years. You dig and look for information on that, you find like 2 sentences.
Yeah,
That's it.
and that was probably an Indian agency, so agencies where an agent was based. And the one we always hear about is the Meeker Agency, because he was trying to make the Utes farmers and then taking their horses away. That really angered them. And then another one was over the Los Pinos, over by, it was just on the other side of Cochito Pass. But I'll bet that was what it was. And then kind of the unorganized area that would have been to the northwest of the corner of our county, which would be north of Bent County now, is actually where the Sand Creek Massacre happened. And again, this has a lot of those maps, so I'll look into that and see. I bet it was probably an agency headquarters.
I've seen a map that had a Arapaho Cheyenne reservation. It was a little northeast of Pueblo.
Okay.
It was at the very top of, of course, Orfano County used to go all the way to the Arkansas River and a little beyond that. And there's a big blob of it. And inside that blob, one map that I saw said it was a Cheyenne Arapaho reservation. And I've never heard of it. Cheyenne Arapaho reservation. Yeah.
Yeah, jump on what you two guys are talking about. Go ahead, David, and then I'll add.
I was going to show, that Orfano County was here, and then that was the area, and that, of course, was where they were sent because it was supposed to be, safe territory when the Sand Creek Massacre happened out there.
Okay.
So that even existed, after the counties, the original 17 counties were organized. So.
Okay.
But I'll look into this Greenwood. I'll bet it was probably the agency title or.
There's definitely no green and no wood.
There we go. Yeah. Another euphemistically named place.
At KRCC, the public station on Colorado Springs, they had a story today about how Colorado State Parks and Wildlife is wanting to give free access to all the state parks for the Southern Mountain Ute and the Ute. A lot of other Indian nations have said, well, wait a minute, just because they're giving it to the Utes because they're the only two that have reservations still in Colorado. But they alluded to the ones that you guys are talking about, there were reservations in eastern Colorado, and the only reason there's not is because they came in, the whites came in and killed all those people and
Mhm.
forced them off the land or killed them.
Sure.
And so there was, and I believe when you and I worked at the museum, we looked at something, it might be what Larry's talking about. There definitely was, it wasn't there for a long time, kind of like what you're talking about.
4 years.
Yeah, and there were reservations out there for those specific tribes that we just mentioned.
Yeah, and so the ones that survived, they were split between Oklahoma and the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, so
So the other
out
tribes,
of Colorado entirely, yeah.
these other tribes are now saying, well, wait a minute, why are we being excluded just because we don't have,
Right.
we have ancestral lands here,
Yeah.
we can prove it, so it's a bit of a controversy now.
Sure.
Because like you said, the Arapaho and Cheyenne didn't show up until, what, 1800?
Right.
You know, they were pretty, recent.
Yeah, and of course, the Navajos ended up with the biggest reservation,
Yeah.
and it was about a third of their actual range, of their historical range, so. Yeah. All right. Anyone
Thank
else?
you, David.
Quotation that I think is very fitting. So, the greatest calling of our lives is to find grace in the very place you stand. And I'm glad you're all standing here.
Oh.